Comrades and friends, good afternoon and welcome to this rally entitled Fight the Tories for Socialism, Not Barbarism. My name's Christine Blower and I'll be chairing this afternoon, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and we've got huge numbers of people signed up. So today's event is the combination of 18 months of various online events, forums, rallies, and many more hosted or streamed. And we're looking forward to both online and physical events going forward. I'm delighted that this afternoon, we've got many different speakers from many different organisations who are joining us to bring greetings and to suggest the ways forward. And this is at a very opportune time for the Labour and Trade Union movement, because we're just ahead of the TUC and Labour conference. I had some opening remarks, but we're not going to be able to be joined by Dave Ward. So I'm delighted that instead of my opening remarks, I'm going to read you a solidarity message from Dave, who is kept away by important union business. Dave says, as we begin to emerge from the pandemic, we're grappling with the challenge of building a post-COVID-19 future. We do so knowing that in the pandemic, there were deep structural imbalances of wealth and power in the world of work, in the economy and the wider society, and they were decades in the making. We're currently facing a future that's burdened with some of the most difficult circumstances in the history of the labour movement. From climate change to the fourth industrial revolution, people are feeling a serious sense of insecurity and anxiety. In order to address this, the fundamental question facing all trade unions, and indeed across the labour movement, is how to unite working people and end inequality and build a coalition of support across race, gender and class to deliver real change. This should be a 1945 moment with a new socialist settlement, not only to rebuild from crisis, but to tackle the very same issues we face that the Beveridge report highlighted then. Trade unions must join together and lead the way through the collective power of campaigning and action, and make that change happen on the ground in our workplaces and in our communities. At the time when political leadership is seriously lacking, we must look to our movement, to our communities, to deliver the change that we desperately need. I urge all of you watching today to follow the TUC Congress and the Labour Party conference later in the month, with an eye to connecting our struggles together so that we can collectively move towards a new social movement. So thanks very much to Dave for that. And I'm just going to mention briefly that we were expecting to be joined by Mick, but alas, he's been laid low by COVID. So we send him solidarity greetings and our best wishes from this rally. And now, without further ado, we move on to our first speaker. Our first speaker is John McDonnell MP, no stranger to any of you on this call. He joins us from the huge demonstration against the arms fair in Liverpool. We're delighted he's found the time to join us, not just from there, but also from the pages of The Guardian, John. So, John McDonnell, the floor is yours. I hope. Yeah, there he is. Unmute. Great.
Christine, can you hear me all right?
I can, perfectly. Thanks very much, John.
Okay, let me just explain. I hope you have already. I'm in Liverpool. I'm on the march against the arms fair.
Yeah.
And look, it's huge. It's absolutely huge. You can get an impression from the flags and banners behind me. There's a large number of, obviously, campaigning organisations, peace campaigners, but also a lot of Labour Party members here and CLP banners and trade union banners. This is a Labour and Trade Union, a Labour and Trade Union event, but with large numbers of social movements here as well. This is the sort of, I think this is the sort of lesson about the movement that we need for the future. Look, I'll just take you through some of the arguments. I did an article for The Guardian this morning. If people get a chance to read it, not that I'm an advocate for The Guardian because it drives me up the wall, to be honest, at times, but if you get a chance to read the article, it's online. And what I'm saying is this in terms of the Labour Party: look, we can't go on like this. Something's got to give. We cannot go on in the way that's happening at the moment. And the failure of the leadership, it is to actually take, first of all, to take Johnson on. if you want to win electorally, what you have to do is nail your opponent and then also present an alternative. And there's no way, there seems to be, the critique of Johnson has to be consistent, exactly as Dawn Butler said and got thrown out of the House of Commons for. It shouldn't have to be Dawn from the back bench, it should be from the front bench. Tell it like it is. Johnson is a corrupt liar. And people understand that more. They no longer are satisfied with his clown antics that maybe some of them thought he was safe and therefore they'd vote for him. I think people have had enough of the lies, they've had enough of the corruption and the contracts through what we've seen in the pandemic. And the Labour Party at the moment don't seem to be laying a glove upon him. You've got to call him out. But the most important thing, though, is that you've got to present an alternative. Time and time again now, and it's cringeworthy, what happens is shadow cabinet members and others are sent out, almost like the poor bloody infantry, to go on air. They do a critique of the Tories, but then when they're asked the question, what's your alternative? They say nothing. Or they say, well, it'll be in the manifesto. Well, excuse me, according to the timetable for manifesto preparation, that could be next year or the year after. And I think at the moment, they've got to wake up to the fact Boris Johnson almost certainly will go in 2023, or there's rumours amongst the Tories now that he could call an election in 2022 because he wants to avoid the COVID inquiry and get himself, well, I think, off the hook of that. You cannot really wait until you've constructed a manifesto before you start setting out some of your basic policies. You're not, some of the key issues that our communities are facing now, they want to know what would Labour do if they were in power to tackle those issues. And you cannot send people out in just media interview in which the question is put by the journalist, what would you do? And there's no answer. My view now is what we've got to do is if the Labour Party leadership won't show any leadership, we're going to have to. And there's a group of Labour communications experts who came up with a proposal to have another pledge card. I think maybe we should. Let's have half a dozen policies that we can advocate, which people realise that there's a Labour Party out there willing to take on the issues that they're confronting within their society. So it could be a series of policies. We can discuss them and debate them, but let's be clear. One, for example, let's say it very clearly. Under Labour, there will be no children living in poverty. No child will go hungry. Full stop. And we'll use the tax system to make sure that happens. Secondly, it's also say there'll be no homeless. We will house our people, make sure everyone's got a decent roof over their heads. Let's also say we'll end low pay with a real living wage. Many of the unions now are campaigning like the bakers for £15 an hour. Why not? Let's lift people out of poverty so that when they go to work, they earn a decent wage. Other arguments, other policies we can put forward. Make sure education is free, both childcare, but also scrapping tuition fees, and to make sure our schools are properly funded. The other issue as well has got to be climate change, hasn't it? We developed the policies of the Green New Deal. We should say 2030 net zero carbon, and we'll do it as a basis of the Green New Deal with a just transition. Excuse me. I think those sorts of policies would enable us to demonstrate to people there is a viable Labour alternative that we can put into practice in going into government. That's got to be our campaign from the left now, both within the party structures, but also for the trade union movement. But also the key element now, just like this demonstration, we've got to link the Labour Party, the trade unions with their industrial struggles, with the social movement struggles. And what proves to me time and time again on huge demonstrations like this, that people are willing to come out and fight for fairness and justice. They're willing to fight for a cause. They're willing to mobilise and win the argument. It's inspirational. Our problem at the moment is the Labour leadership is incapable, it seems, of being able to nail Johnson, not providing an alternative set of policies that can inspire people. But in addition to that, we have to mention it as well, that actually they're diverting the party into internal factional disputes. I find it extraordinary the way in which people are being suspended and expelled from the party now. Some of them for association with prescribed organisations, even before they were prescribed. Where's the natural justice and all that? And I've been talking to JVL, Jewish Voice for Labour, and I've just read their report. Their report demonstrates we're now in our campaign against anti-Semitism in the party. We're now, ironically, absolutely bizarrely, Jewish members associated with JVL are now more vulnerable for disciplinary action and expulsion than anyone else. That cannot be right. So we've got to basically say to the Labour Party leadership, they're going to have to get their act together. Something's got to give. They've got to start taking on Johnson effectively. They've got to ensure that we have an alternative policy programme that can demonstrate to people that we can transform our communities and make sure that we can build an economy that's really an economy that works for everybody. In addition to that, we've got to tell them this factional disputes where they're targeting the left in particular has to end. This Labour Party conference coming up is absolutely key to us. And of course, there's rumours that they're trying to bring forward further rule changes that somehow removes elements of democracy in the party. We've got to make sure that we mobilise this conference to protect democracy within the party itself at every level, both for individuals, for CLPs, but also for national conference. And in addition to that, the democracy of the democratic right to elect a leader of the party, all of those, and select MPs. All of those issues, I think, are key. The most important thing now I want to say, though, is we can only succeed in a first-past-the-post system if we have an electoral coalition within the Labour Party, not beyond it. In a first-past-the-post system, setting up new parties or going elsewhere, whatever people think, it fails. So that's why the most important thing we've got to do in terms of how we direct our resources to a certain extent is stay within the party. But stay within the party, not for emotional reasons. I know that's what motivates some people, but more importantly, stay within the party, because that's the way we can develop a policy program that will provide us with a step towards socialism in this country. That's all I've got to say, Christine, this morning.
Fabulous. I was just going to stop you, so that's absolutely perfect. Thank you very much, John, for joining us from Liverpool and giving us such a great opening to this year's Arise rally. So we look forward to hearing all about it when next we see you. Thanks ever so much, John. Bye-bye. And now we move to our second speaker, mentioned there in dispatches from John, Sarah Woolley, who's the General Secretary of the Bakers Union. And if you want to know what leadership in the trade union movement looks like, here is Sarah.
Thanks, Christine, and thank you, Arise, for the invitation to speak today on this fantastic platform. I'm not sure how I can follow John marching around as he was, but I'll give it a good go. Never has there been a more critical time for us to come together and fight back collectively as a labour movement. Bakers Food and Allied Workers members, like many others, have worked through the pandemic, in our case, keeping the nation fed through the worst 18 months we've ever experienced. Whilst it's great that they were recognised as the key workers we've always known them to be, they've gone out day after day to produce the food that has kept supermarket shelves filled, even when they haven't been in a position, in some cases, to feed themselves and their families. And this hasn't really made them feel like key workers. I'm sure you can remember back when the public were encouraged to clap for our fantastic NHS staff and other key workers. It was lovely for them to be appreciated. However, we know that claps don't pay the bills. And actually a minimum basic hourly rate of £15 per hour, decent sick pay paid at 100% of wages, and a ban on zero-hour contracts would be much more meaningful. In reality, being encouraged to go out and clap on a Thursday evening was nothing more than a distraction technique to divert the public's attention away from the many failings of the Tories through the pandemic. And bar a few exceptions, some on the platform today, it was also a distraction from the lack of challenge and accountability from the Labour Party leadership too. It really says it all when Marcus Rashford and the trade unions have forced more U-turns throughout this than the opposition. Now furlough is coming to an end alongside the removal of the £20 universal credit uplift. Added to that, the Tories' latest greatest ideas of increasing national insurance and suspending the pensions triple lock. It just proves for those that didn't already know, and let's be clear, there's a lot of the public that still seriously see the Tories as a party that looks after them. It proves that they are only interested in their rich donors, their families and the 1%, and are intent on creating more division in our communities. The key workers that they have spent months thanking with empty words are the very people that will be repeatedly hit with these changes and will be plunged further into poverty as a result. This is at a time when food bank use is at its highest recorded and rising, and one in which those producing, selling and delivering food cannot feed themselves and their families. And it's shameful that this government openly demonstrates its contempt for our class over and over again. And instead of focusing on challenging them, the party designed to represent the working class is too busy infighting and expelling people. This has got to change. John's right. We have got to come together again as the Labour movement to hold the Tories to account, working across trade unions, supporting each other to tackle the likes of Amazon, McDonald's, and all the other shameful exploitative employers that put profit before people. Joining campaigns like Ian Byrne's Right to Food, Richard Burgon's improvements to sick pay, or Barry Gardner's Fire and Rehire. Supporting Olivia Blake's 10-minute bill designed to get abuse towards customer-facing workers an offence, and the many other fantastic initiatives our Socialist Labour Party MPs are working on, designed to make our working lives and communities better. If you're watching this and you're not in a trade union, join one. Organise your workplace and your community, because collectively we have the power to force change. The Tories know this, and that is why they continue to try and divide our communities and try to strangle the trade unions. We are the 99%, not Boris and his chums. And when we stand together and fight back collectively, we are a force to be reckoned with. Join a trade union. Let's work together across the many sectors we represent to grow our movement, to empower people, to improve the lives of our members and those working in our industries. Change the rhetoric around the jobs that have historically been seen as low skilled and therefore should be low paid, because those are the jobs that have gotten us through the pandemic. And those doing them deserve to be paid £15 an hour. They deserve proper contracts, not irregular 0 hours ones that can be used to exploit and bully them. They deserve decent sick pay. They deserve not to be bullied and harassed at work by managers. They deserve to be respected at work by the public. They shouldn't be subjected to cruel fire and rehire tactics, and they deserve access to decent, nutritious, healthy food. This only happens when we stand together collectively and demand better. Solidarity.
Thank you so much. That's a really great contribution, Sarah. That was covered loads of points and we were delighted to hear it. Thank you. We now move to Holly Turner, nurse, and NHS workers say no, comrade. So the floor is yours. Over to you, Holly.
Thanks very much, Christine. And yeah, again, thanks for inviting me to speak on this important event. And as I was introduced, I'm an NHS nurse and I'm a campaigner. And I've worked within child and adolescent mental health services in the NHS for many years. And I'd say I've probably spent my entire career becoming increasingly concerned about the dangerously low staffing levels. My team, for example, now we've got several vacancies out and no one's applying, and this is the same across the board. I work in community CAMS. Our CAMS inpatient ward for our county was recently closed to admissions because they had an inspection by the Care Quality Commission who highlighted dangerously low staffing levels. So my fear really is that those wards will never reopen and then there'll be nowhere to put children in our area. So now when children go into crisis in our county, we've got nowhere to admit them close to home. And what upsets and angers me about situations like this is I worked on those wards a decade ago, and working all night after a long day shift wasn't a rarity at all. Trying desperately to fill shifts every day was, that was a daily occurrence, and we screamed out that we were struggling then, as did our colleagues. But nothing changed. In fact, we know it's just continued to get worse, and that is what's left us dangerously underprepared for the pandemic and leaving us dealing with the consequences for years to come. Now, us NHS workers from Band 2 right up to Band 9, we are currently in a fight for our pay. We were offered an insulting 3%, which actually represents further restraint after years of cuts to our pay. Our unions are currently balloting, so any NHS workers that are watching, please return your ballot and vote reject. We need to get the turnout on this ballot. Our colleagues are leaving in droves, and the implications of this affects us all because we know this translates to poor patient care, dangerously high waiting lists, and we know that gives a free pass to the Tories to palm off our services to the rich elite when they, dress them up as failing services. It's clear the government has no intention of investing in the NHS and its staff, and that is why we have privatisation happening now, and our pay is one of the levers, and that's why we really need to fight this battle and why we need everyone getting behind the NHS workers in this. And now we've seen this hike in our national insurance, and this makes our pay rise even less, adding the rate of inflation, and all that we're facing is another year of cuts. Health and social care should be government funded, and we should be taxing the rich who have profited off the back of this pandemic, not increasing tax for some of the lowest paid workers in the country who have literally risked theirs and their families' lives for the past year to keep this country going. This is wrong. Now, I work with children from age 5 with impaired functioning, so you can only begin to imagine how difficult life is for these children and their families, and how much they rely on our health and social care services to just to function every day. I work closely with social care, and most of the families I work with rely on support. However, we know there's a desperate lack of social care staff, and families end up with nothing. And this lack of care staff is really unsurprising when we know 3 out of 4 social care workers are earning less than the living wage. We know this government don't listen to us, arguably because they don't care, and they've got other plans for our health service, which has been demonstrated in the new health and care bill, which they're trying to pass. Now, the threat within that bill of even further powers being offered to the health secretary, equaling less control and powers for the NHS, is terrifying, and we all need to be paying attention to this. We know there's a risk of diluting skill mixes, down-regulating professional bodies, which could implicate staff being moved across trusts to try and plug the gaps in staffing. There's no move to bring contracts back in-house, which is really disappointing for us and our colleagues who are currently outsourced. We've seen nothing in the bill that will increase staff numbers, improve paying conditions, and relieve the stress of staff, not just caused by the pandemic, but years of underfunding. The stress caused by this absolutely unnecessary reorganisation on top of everything else will only further impact on the mental health of our health and social care workers. So at the same time as opening the door to privatisation, that's what they're doing to try and get bigger profits, when we know that these people have already profited throughout the pandemic and made billions out of this crisis. So at the same time, staff are threatened with destruction of their national terms and conditions, and the bill will do nothing to solve the real problems of the NHS, which is lack of resources and staff. And we must be united across the Labour movement to be opposing this bill. So right now, as other speakers are all going to highlight, it's desperately important that we unite across the Labour movement, supporting grassroots organisations and across the trade union movements to mobilise and organise, fight for our services, protect our frontline workers and support the most vulnerable in our society. And most important, as Sarah finished with, join a union. We need to be members more than ever. Thank you, and solidarity.
That's great, Holly. Thank you very much indeed. And as any of us who've also worked in education will know, the real central importance of child and adult mental health services to all of those children whom we see often in our classrooms who are struggling. So yes, get into a union and make sure that we're supporting NHS workers and we're all supporting each other. Thank you very much, Holly. Now we move to our second socialist John of the rally. John Trickett MP, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. It's a great privilege to be here and to follow such fabulous speakers with more to come. Look, I think let's just be clear. There are some who are saying that our policies were too radical under Jeremy Corbyn. They're saying that we lost the election because our manifesto was too left-wing. And this, I think, explains the repeated purges which have been launched against the left in recent months. Somehow they think that Labour can win by shifting our whole movement to the right, but they're wrong. And of course, we didn't get every single thing right, one of which was perhaps being too tolerant to those who thought it was okay for them to repeatedly attack our party leader, especially in the run-up to the general elections. But, and this is my central point, left policies and ideas are now more relevant than they ever were. How else could you explain the fact that the Tories haven't yet dared to launch a full-scale austerity attack on the public services, though it's coming? And why is it that they decided to use state power to borrow billions of pounds in order to introduce their furlough scheme? But if you look carefully at the opinion polls, there are still significant majorities for all the radical ideas which Labour had in the run-up to the last two elections. So I remain optimistic about the future. I've said this before. Look at Labour's proposals in 2017, 2019. Of course, we made mistakes, but we must learn from those, not to repeat them, but equally, we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. After all, it was our transformative agenda which united the rank and file of the whole movement. It galvanized tens of thousands of people drawn into activism for the first time, and it inspired millions to come and vote for us. Proposals on universal public provision, whether it was broadband or care or education or railways. We sought to tackle the climate crisis. As we know, Labour had plans to decarbonise the economy, modernise public transport, retrofit social housing. And all of this would require massive public investment and a progressive government prepared to act. And we didn't shrink away from any of that. We were willing to take the necessary steps to fund it. We would have tackled the obscene inequalities in income and wealth. We would have taxed the top 5% of earners and looked at taxing the billions of those who tax avoid in the corporations elsewhere. Meanwhile, we would not have sought to tax the poorest in society as the Tories are planning to do. But let's not be in any doubt. We are facing a full-scale Tory attack, both on our services and on working class living standards. We can see it happening this autumn in the coming weeks. The ending of furlough, withdrawal of universal credit, suspension of the pensions triple lock, the increase in national insurance, which we saw this week, real-term reductions in public sector pay. Let's call all of this what it is. It's the barbarism of a class war, but waged on behalf of the wealthiest against the rest of the country. It is barbarism in a country to see billionaires whose wealth is growing exponentially, and yet millions of children left in poverty, where you have the cruelty, for example, of Grenfell, and the victimization of migrants and so many other minorities. But how could it be otherwise? After all, it's the wealthiest in our society who fund the Tories. They aren't subject to this assault, are they? Their income and their wealth continues to grow year on year. Labour now needs to fight all of this with a message of hope. And that hope has to be the promise of socialism. So let's say to our leadership, as I did in the Commons a few weeks ago, that they need to cast aside their timidity. They've been too focused on internal matters. The purges must end, the attacks on internal democracy, the command and control approach to local party meetings. They think we lost the election because of our policies, but if they want to explain what really happened, maybe they should start by taking a long, cold look in the mirror and ask themselves whether they helped or hindered us in the run-up to the election. So it's down to us, the left, to lead the argument in the Labour movement and to take it into the wider country where our ideas will be well received. And let me make one final point. Speaking to the left, to my colleagues on the left, let me say this. This is not a type of pessimism or for defeatism, for flaking away from the struggle, nor should we be indulging in factionalism, competition, or individualistic ways of operating. We need to unite in a collective fight for justice. After all, it's less than 2 years ago, we were the leadership of a movement for transformational change, the whole world watching, heading for an electoral contest where we would have gained government power. And look then just this year, the two closely fought elections in unison, where we see again reasons for optimism. And I think we can be more radical than we were actually. We can be more populist, for example, in our economics. 4 thoughts come to mind. First, why has Labour so often limited itself to taxing income rather than wealth? If we're serious about tackling the inequities of capitalism, then we must surely be prepared to take on the overwhelming power of capital itself. And why is unearned income taxed less than earned income? Dividends earned from shares is a case in point, taxed less than wages earned. And then there is the ocean of money, an ocean of money lying unspent in the bank accounts of wealthy corporations. Last time I looked, there was almost £1 trillion unspent cash in corporate bank accounts. That should be mobilised for our people. And is it time once again to renationalise the Bank of England? Comrades, this is
1 minute, please, John.
I'm finishing. Comrades, this is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, but this wealth is in the hands of a few. Comrades, we can do this, but only if we use our intellects, if we radiate hope, and if we show that we can unify. Let's make it happen.
Thank you very much, John. All really important and brilliant ideas. And as Comrade Lavery always says, they don't call it the struggle for nothing.
Exactly.
So you're absolutely right, John. We have to get on and get involved in the struggle. Okay, I'm now going to call Sam Browse, who's an Arise volunteer, who's going to talk to us about Arise for just 2 minutes, please.
Hello, comrades. It's great to be joining you today. I'm just going to talk a little bit about Arise, who we are and what we do. We are a festival that runs annually. This is our annual rally, brings together the best ideas of the left. Today, you saw they were coming directly from Liverpool at the AOC arms trade demonstration. So current as ever. The first thing I want to do is really stress that we're a voluntary organisation. We're run by volunteers and volunteer time. We can only put on events like this that bring all these bring all these people together, bring all these labour movements together, these socialists together, and campaigners from across the globe with your help. So please, please, please hit the donate button today. That should be posted in the chat. I can't emphasise that enough. If you all just donate like £5 today, that would basically pay for our Zoom for the foreseeable. So remember to hit the donate button. The second thing I wanted to do was just plug some of our events that are coming up too. So after the Labour Party conference, we'll be having a Labour Party conference report back and next steps discussion. That's with Richard Burgon, who's on the call today, Nadia Jammer, who's a Left NEC member, and Rachel Garnham, who's the Vice Chair of CLPD. We'll be hearing from CLPD later today as well. That's on Monday, the 4th of October, 6:30 p.m. So hopefully we'll see you at that. The second event we've got coming up is organised with Privy magazine. It's called System Change, Not Climate Change, a Green New Deal for People and Planet. That's with Rebecca Long-Bailey, Scarlett Westbrook of Teach the Future, and the economist Grace Blakely. That's on Thursday, the 14th of October at 6:30 p.m. So I'd encourage you to get to that as well. Like I said, that's organised with Privy magazine. Just one more plea: hit that donate button. Like I say, we really need your donations. Together, we're fighting the bosses. They've got loads of money. We've got none. So it's only through organising and pooling our resources that we can fight back and put on events like this. I'm sure you agree. I'm already galvanised. I'm already really excited, and really put out the arguments for socialism and for the better world we want to live in. So thanks very much, Christine, for letting me do that plug. And like I say, hit that donate button, everyone. Thanks.
That's great, Sam. It'll be wonderful, won't it, when we can get back into halls and pass around buckets and make remarks about make sure you put in paper money because it doesn't make so much noise and all that kind of stuff. So in the interim, we have to do it online. So, and I'm sure you all agree that these Arise events have been and will be brilliant and definitely worth supporting. Okay, now I move to our next speaker. We're joined by Anne Galpin from the TUC Disabled Workers Committee, who I'm sure will give us lots of important information about where we are with disabled workers in the current situation. Anne, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, comrades. I co-chair TUC Disabled Workers with Dave Allan, who was our build speaker, but he's not able to join us today. He sends solidarity, and you'll have opportunities to hear from him at Trade Union Congress, which will be live streaming tomorrow through to Tuesday and represents over 1 million disabled workers. I'm also a lay activist within my own union, the NUJ, and a member of DPAC, Disabled Peoples Against the Cuts. Pre-pandemic, disabled people face multiple inequalities. We face political and structural oppression in all aspects of our lives. 11 years of austerity politics had unleashed a regime of fear and poverty, of conditionality and sanctions, massive cuts to social care support and social security, changes to the welfare system that have left disabled adults 4 times worse off financially than non-disabled adults. Research shows that nearly half of us, of those in poverty, a total of 6.9 million people in the UK, are from families which include a disabled person. TUC research has found that disabled people were more than 3 times likely to have had to use food banks than non-disabled people. It is therefore unsurprising that access to food has been a significant issue for disabled people during the pandemic. As Ken Loach's film evidenced, we are all Daniel Blake. In 2016, the United Nations Special Rapporteur Philip Alston found the UK government guilty of grave and systematic violations of disabled people's rights and creating a human catastrophe. This in a society whose economy is rich enough to support disabled people to live independently with dignity and respect, not just to subsist, but to thrive, to live well. Make no mistake, this is ideologically driven and by political choice. Then came the pandemic, which of course has changed all of our lives, but it has hit disabled people disproportionately. 6 in 10 COVID-related deaths are among disabled people. So where over 100,000 people have died, that means over 60,000 disabled people have lost their lives. If you're a disabled woman, you are 11.3 times more likely to die from COVID than a non-disabled woman. Disabled colleagues have seen unlawful do not resuscitate notices issued and imposed on disabled patients. We have heard excuses and explanations. We have been told those who died were older people in care homes, had underlying health conditions or learning disabilities. These excuses, they are unacceptable. What they are actually saying is that some lives matter less than others. The excuses do not mitigate the fact that many of those who have died did not have to. The government has badly botched the handling of the pandemic, and disabled people have paid the price more than some. Indeed, some of us have paid the price often with our lives when we did not have to. Never has it been more urgent to promote a collective trade union and left approach to protecting disabled people's rights. We can do this by addressing long COVID, supporting shielders, holding employers to account in their duty of care, and calling for more flexible working practices that meet workers' physical, mental health needs and family commitments. We can't allow the small gains made for disabled workers from mass remote working to be thrown out because employers are either trying to force everyone back to pre-pandemic ways of working or forcing everyone to remote work as a way of arbitrarily cutting costs. We must link equality, disability and reasonable adjustments with a health and safety agenda to ensure that disability equality forms a core part of our bargaining agenda. We must organise against threats to our human rights and the ability of journalists and the wider public to hold the government and public bodies to account. We must challenge the proposed reforms to the Official Secrets Act, which would treat journalists in the same way as spies if they received leaked information from whistleblowers, even if they don't publish or share any of it. Ditto the Police and Crime Commissioner's Bill proposals to restrict our right to peaceful protest, a bedrock of any democratic society. Challenging the National Disability Strategy outlined in the Green Paper on Health and Disability, which is a failure and could, to quote campaigner Ian Jones, be retitled, "How can we pay less money to disabled people?" Resources and services for disabled people are the first to be cut at the point when we need them the most. We've always known that, but the emergency response to the pandemic has exposed that attitude beyond all doubt. We call on the wider trade union movement, the left and civil society to be our allies as we fight for our fundamental human rights to be respected, promoted and put into practice. If you're at Congress, please support the Disabled Workers Conference motion on COVID. Help fight the impending cut to universal credit of £20 per week, alongside the fact that it was never applied to legacy benefits. Support disabled people against the cuts days of actions on Saturday the 25th and Tuesday the 28th of September around our legal challenge, 20 more for all at the High Court on the 28th of September. The £20 cut isn't the only change that is coming in that will affect millions of low-paid workers on universal credit. The minimum income floor is coming back for self-employed workers, but it's being introduced gradually, we think, because this will hit people really hard. So we think the government wants to spread out its impact. Also coming back in, sanctions and conditionality. With recruitment crisis in a number of sectors since Brexit made worse by the pandemic, it seems clear that the government want to be able to force people who lost work through the pandemic into filling jobs that aren't adequately paid. Social care funding, as others before me have described, sets to increase national insurance, but without being clear how much of the additional funding this will raise, without being clear how much of the additional funding this will raise will go towards social care or how it will address the current crisis. We have a severe social care recruitment crisis exacerbated by the government's incompetent handling of social care freedom of movement issues since the EU withdrawal.
I'm going to ask you to wrap up in a couple of sentences,
right.
please.
There's a whole lot there, and we can talk more about it anytime if you, if you take anything away from my words today, please be it that the oppression of disabled people is the collective issue for all of us on the left, that an injury to one is an injury to all. Solidarity.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Anne. That was a pretty comprehensive look at those issues. Thank you for joining us and stepping in when Dave was unable to join us. Our next speaker is Shami Chakrabarti, whom I'm very much looking forward to hearing. And if you have the chance, look up her speech in Hansard from yesterday on refugees. Shami, the floor is yours. Speak, mute.
Unmute.
Yeah.
Okay, you missed the best bit, but I won't say it again. No. I was going to say thank you, Christine. It's an absolute joy to be here with so many comrades today, and it's always a privilege to be chaired by you. Now, I'm sure that all our hearts were lifted when we saw John Mack on that wonderful, vibrant demo in Liverpool. The only bitter tinge for me was knowing that this awful police bill that is coming back to Parliament next week would be capable, very, very capable of shutting down a peaceful, vibrant demonstration like that, just if it made some noise or an impact on anyone in the local community. That is what we're up against with, in my view, a far-right government that is the worst government that I can remember. And I don't say that lightly because I was a child during Thatcher. Now, how dare I call Boris Johnson's government a far-right government? Because for me, it has the classic hallmarks of that kind of ideology. On the one hand, there is freedom for the super wealthy and the corrupt. On the other hand, there is total oppression for ordinary people, the poorest in particular, and there's interference with fundamental rights and freedoms and even the rule of law itself. And the pandemic has been a perfect parable of this kind of contempt, not just for rights and freedoms, but for individual human beings and their lives. We remember the elderly and the vulnerable tipped out of NHS wards last year and poured into overcrowded care homes without adequate testing or PPE to meet, in so many cases, their early and unnecessary death. Let's remember, we have lost in 18 months double the civilian casualties of the whole of World War II. And this coronavirus legislation was asymmetric authoritarianism. I don't remember reading about the health and safety executive or the police busting up unsafe warehouses of Amazon or busting up unsafe building sites. But we have seen so many tales of oppression against peaceful women campaigning at a vigil on Clapham Common, and so many other vulnerable people. This asymmetric, abusive use of power is what we've been up against with Boris Johnson and Priti Patel, and there's more of it to come. Now, Priti Patel and I are both daughters of migrants, but as I said yesterday, Christine, in the House, we have very different approaches to migration as a result of that shared experience. And she would literally turn small boats away in the English Channel filled with desperate people and send those boats to sink and those people to die. Now that's all very bleak for me, and I don't want to be bleak, because today marks 20 years of 9/11. That was a terrible, terrible day. It was a terrible human rights atrocity, but some appalling mistakes were also made thereafter. And that day was the start of my career and my life in activism. I was told we would never defeat detention without charge or trial. I was told we would never defeat identity cards. I was told that these things were impossible. There were too few of us, or we didn't have the power to take on the forces of wealth and power in this country, across the Atlantic and in the world. But those skeptics were wrong. We found our power, and we found that power in each other, and in the magic word that you've heard already so many times today, a word that the last few years saw come back into fashion in this movement and way beyond it. It's now a word in common parlance. And that word translates into every language on earth. And the Christians call it fellowship, and the Muslims call it Ummah, and some African peoples call it Ubuntu. And it's a word that describes the place we want to get to and the means of transport as well. That word is our solution. That word is our inspiration and our hope. And it's solidarity. And that's what I wish for you. That's what I get from you. That's what we share with each other. And that's how we'll find our way back to the brink and into power.
Oh, Shami, thank you so much. Thank you so much, comrades. Great to hear from you. And I know that you've got to go, but it was brilliant that you were able to join us. Thank you very much indeed, Shami. And now I move to another great leader of the trade union movement. It's Matt Wrack, General Secretary of the FBU and Committee Chair of the Chair of the Labour Representation Committee. Matt, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Christine, and hello, comrades, sisters and brothers. And when I was invited to speak here, I did think, looked at the title of the rally, and I thought how appropriate it was for socialism, not barbarism. And I want to address the second half of that briefly for a moment, because we need to look at our individual struggles, but we also need to look at how they fit together in this country and indeed around the world. Because I think the truth is we are seeing unfolding barbarism across the world. Shami has just mentioned 9/11. It would be remiss of me not to mention the same. Those were barbaric attacks in which some 3,000 civilians were killed in a terror attack. And as a firefighter, we particularly pay tribute to the 343 firefighters who lost their lives entering the Twin Towers while thousands of other people were trying to escape. And it's an impact that has our members around the UK and our colleagues across the world think about very carefully today and always. But of course, that attack was followed by invasion, by war, by occupation, by corruption, and now, of course, by the defeat of the United States and the West in Afghanistan and the return of the Taliban. And sadly, we see very little real debate around these issues and the real lessons which we need to learn as a result of 20 years of a failed adventure in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other countries in the Middle and Near East. We hear today that yesterday reports that in US airstrikes over the past 20 years, some 22,000 civilians have been killed. We see that in Afghanistan, Iraq and Syria, those policies of invasion and occupation have created a living hell with war, terror, refugees, and society almost destroyed in large parts of those countries. The second area where I want to discuss the question of emerging barbarism is in relation to the pandemic that we have lived through and we continue to live through. Some 4.5 million people across the world have died as a result of that. Tens of thousands in the United Kingdom, one of the richest countries in the world. And the truth is that the COVID pandemic has exposed, both in the UK and across the world, the huge inequalities which exist within societies and internationally. We've seen in our own country a huge lack of planning, the undermining of public services. We've seen class divisions exposed, with key workers being required to attend work throughout the pandemic and consequently paying the burden in terms of increased infection rates and increased deaths. Yet nevertheless, in the public sector, being told that they should accept continued pay freezes, and in the private sector facing fire and rehire, the stark inequalities of our society laid bare in the pandemic. And then, of course, we face an existential crisis as a result of climate change and the emerging climate catastrophe. This summer has exposed very clearly what is meant by extreme weather events. We've seen floods and wildfires across much of the world, including in some of the richest countries of the world. In the United States and Canada, both extremes of weather have been seen, with appalling wildfires and at the same time floods. In New York City, one of the richest cities in the world, we see illegal, unlawful basement flats have been flooded, leading to the loss of poor and working class lives, again, in one of the richest countries in the world. We see similar events across Europe, in India and in Africa. And climate change, of course, makes the case more eloquently than any of us can for internationalism, for the need for international solidarity and cooperation, and also, of course, for working class unity. Because we hear from those in power endlessly that they plan market solutions to the climate catastrophe. I think for me, it is absolutely clear that we cannot trust big business, multinational corporations driven by profit to resolve the climate catastrophe. We need to argue for a completely different solution, a solution based on internationalism, on international solidarity. And it's been mentioned already, the question of class war. I think all those three unfolding elements of barbarism also expose the class war within each country and internationally. And we need to wake up and organise within the United Kingdom and across Europe and across the world. Today is also another anniversary, September 11th. It's also the anniversary of the coup in 1973 in Chile, where a left government was overthrown by the armed forces of Chile with the support of the United States and others. That exposes very sharply what those opposed to us will do when necessary to protect their power and their interests. The only answer, I think, for us as workers, as trade unionists, is to organise ourselves, to be clear that we set out a vision of an entirely different society, a society that ends the rule of profit, that puts the majority really and genuinely in the driving seat. And that's about socialism. And that's the other side of what the title of this rally is about. And we set out the needs for working class unity in our own country, across Europe and across the world. We unite here, we organise for a decent society. We remember we are the many, they are the few.
That's great, Matt. Thank you very much indeed. I was just about to ask you to wrap up in a couple of sentences and you ended absolutely perfectly. Our next speaker takes up the issues actually that were raised by Matt in his in his remarks there about the need for internationalism, the need for international solidarity, the need for us to work both across the social movements in our own country, but also internationally. So I'm delighted that we're being joined today by Bhaskar Sankara from Jacobin, USA. Bhaskar, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the invitation, and it's an honor to be with you today and to see so many familiar faces after all these years. Hopefully, I'll be able to see some of you in person too soon. I'm speaking to you now from Fargo, North Dakota, actually. And Fargo, North Dakota, for those not familiar with the United States, is not exactly a hotbed of radicalism today. But 100 years ago or so, there were 175 branches of the Socialist Party of America just here in North Dakota alone. Roughly 1 in every 70 or so adults in the state were dues-paying members of the Socialist Party. And these people were, by and large, working people struggling to survive in a harsh environment. They were people who, whatever their level of education or scant previous ideological training or whatever else, knew that their enemies were bankers and big industrialists and railroad interests and others. And they knew that these people weren't on their side. And they only had one means to oppose them, which was to band together in unions, to form socialist parties, to form producer cooperatives. It was instinctive that they identified the harm being done against them, and they identified the solution in collective action and solidarity. Today, North Dakota is something very different. It's a state with an entrenched right wing, where almost all the elected representatives are from the Republican Party. It's a state that's in many ways a vision of the most extreme case of de-alignment, the case that happens when labor-based populism collapses and the political void is filled over time by the right. And I think that the challenge for socialists and trade unionists in the decades to come won't necessarily be fine-grained programmatic ones. They won't be necessarily on a terrain that is entirely ideological. They will be battles over who can win a social base, battles over whether we can cement a left coalition that can maintain and deepen its roots among a broad working class. Because once a political formation has those roots, once a political formation gets to the point where the lines between a trade union movement, a socialist movement, and social movements against oppression are blurred, we've created the type of movement that can win power and transform society. We've created the type of movement that can instinctively come to the policy solutions and the ideological stances that best meet the needs of working people. Through the Bernie Sanders campaign in the United States, we found a language and a means to reach people who've never would have called themselves a socialist in a million years, but agreed with our core message of fighting for, in the US, universal healthcare, fighting for a jobs guarantee, and fighting against the tiny minority of millionaires and billionaires who benefit from the conditions that working people are subjected to. In the US, obviously, we're building a working class movement from almost scratch. And in Britain, you have a stronger and more recent tradition of left-wing trade unionism and working class struggle. But I think similarly, we have a very tight window. And in this window of opportunity we have now, even after the respective defeats of Bernie Sanders and the Labour Party in the recent elections, we have a window where we need a degree of discipline. We need to figure out what parts of our program to foreground and how to make those parts of our program the pertinent issues of the day, the terrain upon which elections will be run. We need these elections to be run on messages of anti-austerity, on public goods, on jobs, speaking to the majority that we have on our addition on these individual policy points. Because like John Trickett mentioned, we have a majority already on these individual anti-austerity and left-wing progressive economic issues, we just haven't been able to cement this into a majority political coalition. But I do think that working class majority that once even stirred the souls of there weren't quite millions of people at the time here, but at least tens of thousands of people in places like Fargo, North Dakota still exists, and it's waiting for a political force to activate it. And I think we can be a important spark in creating that force. But perhaps to end on a pessimistic note, if we wait too long, if we dilute our class program into broad progressivism in the pursuit of short-term electoral gains, or if we let class struggle more broadly morph into a war about discourses or culture or whatever else, we'll lose this window, and we'll lose generations of working people, not necessarily just to right-wing populists, but a lot of them to apathy, to the idea that politics can't change their lives, that has nothing to offer them. And that's obviously a path that has existential consequences for our societies and for the planet. But it does give me great and renewed hope to be around all of you today, and to know that so many people are still committed to this struggle and this type of change.
Gosh, thank you so much for giving us your time from North Dakota, and a message of hope, but also of urgency. We have to get on with it. We are the people to do it. Thank you so much for joining us. Okay, we're going to move to now Jake Rubin from the CPLD, who is going to give us a conference preview. I think we might be able to do that in 3 or 4 minutes. Jake.
Yeah, I'll keep it short. I'll keep it short. Thank you.
Over to you.
Yeah, I'll keep it short. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name's Jake Rubin, and I'm an Assistant Secretary at the Campaign for Labour Party Democracy. And I've been asked to speak about what we sort of believe are the big priorities for the Labour conference at the end of this month, which obviously is a hugely important event for socialists in Britain. So I'm going to give an overview of where I think we're at in the Labour Party, and then what that means for the priorities for the conference. So where do we find ourselves? I think fundamentally what is being fought over in the Labour Party is, will it support an agenda of progressive reforms, or is it going to capitulate to the reactionary policies of the Tory party? The British establishment and the Labour right are absolutely determined that the Labour Party should never again have a programme for government that would end poverty and austerity, combat racism and oppose the US war drives. So the Labour Party conference is going to be a really key battleground in opposing the current trajectory of the party. And there are some key issues that CLPD has identified that are going to be coming up at the conference on policy, on rule changes and some internal elections that we think are going to be microcosms of this broader battle in British politics. So firstly, I'll start with what I think we can achieve from a policy perspective at this year's conference. There's going to be 20 topics for delegates to discuss and vote on, which is much more than in the past. But of course, we know very well that just because something is passed on at a Labour conference doesn't mean it's going to be implemented by the leadership. Nevertheless, it's very clear that there is a broad policy platform, that there is broad support of the policy platform from Corbyn's era in both the Labour's membership and in the trade unions. And so conference will give us a platform to urge the leadership to start providing serious opposition to the Tory government, whether that's on a COVID elimination strategy, as opposed to the Tory herd immunity, on austerity, on Black Lives Matter, on Palestine, on Ireland, or on the environment. We can use these motions discussed and the platform time given to urge Keir Starmer to stop marking the government's homework and actually set out a vision for how Labour will improve people's lives and change the country for the better so that Labour can win the next general election. So that's where we are on policy, I think. But there are also a number of rule changes that are coming up at the Labour Party conference. The one that we think is probably the biggest priority is a rule change proposed by 17 CLPs that CLPD has been promoting about making the Parliamentary Labour Party accountable to Labour Party's conference. The rule change, if it was agreed, would require the Parliamentary Labour Party to report on conference on its work to carry out the party programme in between conferences, and also it would make the chief whip to report on any decisions to suspend a whip from a Labour MP. And these decisions on the whip could be overturned by the conference. So Obviously, it's no secret that if this rule change would be passed at conference, the whip could be restored to Jeremy Corbyn at this year's conference. So it's obviously time that we end the absolute farce that we can have a sitting member of parliament who is a Labour MP and a former leader of the Labour Party, but who is banned from taking the Labour whip. Delegates at this conference have a chance to change this and should support and should do so by supporting this rule change. And the last big thing we think is that there's a very crucial election happening, internal election happening at this year's conference. So under the rules of the Labour Party, the General Secretary of the Labour Party is actually elected by party conference on recommendation of the NEC. And the NEC is recommending the current acting General Secretary, David Evans. It's in Labour's interest that he is not endorsed. Labour needs a General Secretary that will prioritise building an organisation capable of fighting the Tories and winning for Labour. But the current priorities of the stewardship currently seems to be to attack and expel Labour's members and rain down diktat after diktat after diktat, trampling on the party's long-standing traditions of freedom of expression. I know this firsthand as the CLP secretary of my local party and the devastating effects that we've actually had on our morale on the ground that restricts our ability to campaign for the Labour Party. And also we've seen how bad the effects of this have been on the party finances, with the Labour Party having to lay off staff. Unite the Union's executive recently unanimously agreed to reject the appointment of the acting General Secretary, and so CLPD is also encouraging CLP and trade union delegates to do the same. Finally, if you would like to stay updated on the Labour Party conference, please do fill in the Campaign for Labour Party Democracy's conference delegates form. I'm hoping the link will be shared in the chat, and so if you fill it in, you can receive updates and up-to-date information about the conference with recommendation on voting, on references back, and so on and so forth. We're going to be following every twist and turn at the conference and giving up-to-date advice for delegates on the conference floor, as well as producing a daily Yellow Pages daily briefing for delegates with all the key information. So I hope that covers some of the priorities for Labour Party conference. And thanks so much for having me today on Solidarity.
That's great, Jake. Very clear and a very full description. Thank you very much. Okay, now we move to Solma Ahmed, who is from Labour's Women's Committee, and she's also from the NCG, the National Coordinating Group of Momentum. Solma, the floor is yours. Don't forget to unmute.
Sorry, I'm here
That's
now.
it, go.
Yes.
Yep.
Hi, so good to be here, with all these great socialists. I've been asked to give a brief report from the first Women's Committee meeting that we had on 9th of September and talk about Islamophobia. Our first meeting took place on 9th of September. It was a good, constructive and well-attended meeting. We got a lot done after the introduction was over. We chose our chair, Ruth Hayes from Unite, unanimously. We are allowed 2 vice chairs, and there are 3 nominations, so we'll be voting over the weekend. I pointed out that one of them should be a BME woman, because I feel we need to set standards and tone right from the beginning. Everyone managed to contribute. No one felt threatened or shouted down. This is how we want CLPs to operate. We want to see no bullying, harassment, misogyny, or undermining by the party machine and some members at CLPs. This is why we will be looking at strengthening and setting up women's branches with support and advice. A subcommittee will be set up to look at the support and training needs of women branches. We also looked at the terms of reference and rules. We agreed to meet at least 3 times a year. We've got a lot to do, especially after the pandemic, where women are affected disproportionately, including increasing violence against women. We had a report from the Women's Committee on the last conference. We were told that good attendance, good speakers, good feedback were received on that online conference. But more needs to be done, we recognize, to make the conference accessible and engaged with the wider community. We were given presentation on all women shortlist by Annalise Dodd. It seems we have met the equality target for the Parliamentary Labour Party, which is brilliant news. However, Areas where women's equality has not been achieved, all women shortlist will remain legal, for example, council election. Next meeting, analysts suggested that we have presentation on complaint structures and sexual harassment. I'm truly looking forward to that discussion. Now moving on to Islamophobia, I just want to start off with, does anybody care about Islamophobia? I feel neither the government nor my party cares about Islamophobia. And perhaps even the wider society based on the social media and online attacks when I talk about Palestine or transphobia. Recent attacks on my view on trans issues was most vicious and hurtful. It seems as a Muslim woman, I cannot be supporters of trans people. But you see, when you passionately believe in equalities and go through the same pain when you are attacked just because of your faith or your color, you understand and feel what it's like to be hated. This week, Zara Sultana's pain in her voice and tears in her eyes were all too familiar for me. She and Afsana has consistently spoken out against Islamophobia. But where are my other brothers and sisters and left comrades who occupy those spaces of influence? I feel they're not there for me. My own party that I thought where I could be made to feel at home, a party of anti-racist. What about our own record before we speak about other parties? Well, you all know about the Labour Muslim Network report. 29% of Muslim members have directly experienced Islamophobia. 44% have no confidence in the party. 46% of Muslim members believe the party does not represent them. These figures should have made our leadership stand up and listen to our feelings. Instead, we are attacked from all angles. Recent events at Bartley and Span proved how comfortable we feel in the party. But hey, Muslims are blamed for the narrow victory. When we protest through the ballot boxes, we are called traitors. We were smeared as bigots and anti-Semites. And just to rub salt in our wounds, what does my party do? They let Trevor Phillips back into the party, man who said, we see the world differently. We are a nation within a new nation. When decent, hardworking, lifelong members are expelled for far less crime. So what does that tell me? It tells me my party does not give a damn about my feelings. I can't end here without talking about the government in power, of course. Prime Minister who called us letterboxes and bank robbers. After 2 years of promise, the government is now looking at definition of Islamophobia. What's wrong with the APPG definition? It's not good enough for Tories. They rejected that definition, saying it was not in line with Equalities Act 2010 and could undermine free speech. As though they care about Equalities Act and free speech when they're trying to kill that with that bill, police bill against democracy, protest and freedom of speech. That is going through the parliament. The hypocrisy of our government gives me the shivers. I'm actually tired of talking about Islamophobia and repeating myself. Some of you listening probably saying, Salma, we heard it all from you. You see, people like me, Afsana, Zara, Mish, and the few writers, Muslim writers we have on social media, we will repeat ourselves until we are listened to and things change. Outspoken Muslim women MPs face far worse kind of attacks than what many of us go through in terms of Islamophobia in my party. I just want to leave you with one quote from a journalist, Basit Mahmood, co-editor of Left Foot Forward, said this week, the fight against Islamophobia isn't one that demands special treatment for Muslim communities, but equal treatment. There shouldn't be hierarchy of racism amongst politicians. We should all abhor and seek to combat all forms of hatred. Solidarity, my friends.
Thank you so much, Salma. That was a very impressive and persuasive presentation. And now I move to Matt Willgress from Arise and Labour Outlook. Over to you, Matt.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you to all our speakers. Thank you to over 1,000 people that are watching live now and everyone who watches later. And thank you also to over 50,000 different people who have registered for Arise events during the last 18 months. I'll be very quick. I think the first thing that we need to do here today as the left and the Labour movement is understand the scale of what we are up against. And that is why the title of today's event, To Fight the Tories for Socialism, Not Barbarism, is so relevant, as others have said. Boris Johnson's government have launched a massive offensive on all fronts. Every week we see more attacks, from the national insurance hikes this week to the let it rip approach to the pandemic, which is now still costing over 200 lives a day, and a continuous scapegoating of refugees, Muslims, disabled people, and others. This is combined with a hard right foreign policy agenda, including starting a new nuclear arms race. But we also need to understand that we haven't seen anything yet. We need to understand the scale of the attacks we still to face, starting with millions being plunged into despair by the end of furlough and a cruel universal credit cut. The Tories are leading us to barbarism, just as some of their allies internationally, such as their chum Bolsonaro in Brazil and Modi in India, are also doing. Such a prospect means that on the left, we cannot engage in self-indulgence. We must instead rise to the challenges ahead and the radical scale of responses needed. We need to be organising resistance to Johnson's agenda right now and give all we can in full solidarity with those communities, unions and popular causes making a stand against this reactionary agenda. Alongside this, there must be no room on the left for adapting to the politics of scapegoating migrants and others for the problems caused by austerity. We cannot adapt to this. Anti-racism, black liberation and support for black self-organisation must be central to our politics, not an occasional add-on. The same is true of our anti-war internationalism and solidarity for global justice. The ruling class organises globally, we must too. As well as seeking to support, reach out and organise with new allies, of course, we must also continue to fight for party, democracy and social policies in Labour. It is false to argue that work inside Labour and building movements in our workplaces, communities and the streets are counterposed or contradictory. As the great Tony Benn argued again and again, both are essential and supplement each other. And within Labour, the left must work together and it must work together beyond it. We are delighted to have had the LRC, CLPD and Momentum with us today. We've been delighted to have Save Our Socialists, Tribune, No Holding Back, The Morning Star, Labour for a Green New Deal, Labour C&D, Labour Women Leading, and many others at our previous events, and also vital campaigns beyond Labour, such as the People's Assembly, Stand Up to Racism, CND, Stop the War, and many more. My final point then is that I believe, like John said earlier, that the left remains a major force in British politics if it wants to be at the present time, but we can't take this for granted. Those who want to dampen resistance to the Tories' agenda are seeking to divide, demoralise and defeat us. Let's not let them. Solidarity, comrades.
Thank you so much, Matt. And we all know how central Arise has been to making sure that people stay on a really good, progressive and positive agenda. I now move to Kat Hobbs from We Own It. Kat, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christine. Thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here. My name's Kat. I'm from We Own It. We campaign for public services in public hands. And I want to talk about a poll this week on Johnson's national insurance rise, which I think offers some hope for Labour. It had Labour coming out ahead of the Tories with 35%, the Tories on 33%. But importantly, this poll showed that people don't believe that the Tories care about improving the NHS. 31% believe that they do, but 53% correctly believe that the Tories do not care about improving our NHS. So Johnson's move this week left the Conservatives looking as though they weren't either the party of low taxes or the party of improving public services. Obviously, that's just one poll, but I think Labour has a huge opportunity here to be defending public services while the Conservatives are, potentially going to go down as the party that damaged our NHS. We've got 5.6 million people on waiting lists right now. It's a huge issue for the Tories. There are people waiting for vital operations like cancer care, ear, nose and throat operations, hip replacements, people waiting to be seen about their mental health. It's an absolute scandal. And those people are really suffering. And many of them are also, if they can afford it, thinking about whether they need to go private. And that is pushing us in the direction of a two-tier health system like the US has, which, as we know, is absolutely disastrous. Labour can be there saying the NHS should be there for everyone, and it is saying a lot of that, but I think there's so much scope for more. And of course, we have to point out in this context that this isn't just about COVID. We went into this pandemic unprepared. In 2019, waiting lists were already at 4.6 million people, and that's because the Conservative Party has been underfunding our NHS for 10 years. We've lost 20,000 beds in hospitals. We've lost over 100 A&Es, and we're short of 90,000 staff in our NHS. And alongside these cuts, the Conservatives are privatising our NHS, as we all know. The 2012 Act meant that the Secretary of State no longer has a duty to provide comprehensive care, the very point of our NHS. Since that Act, more and more private companies have been getting contracts, and there's double the amount of funding now going to the private sector, NHS funding. Our supply chain for PPE, part of why we were left so unprepared was because that actual supply chain is privatised and outsourced. And of course, the Tories chose to give contracts, private contracts, to their mates in Deloitte when the crisis hit, and £37 billion to Serco and Citel for Dido Harding's failed contact tracing and test and trace operation. And they've also promised £10 billion to the private sector to help deal with the backlog, while at the same time, they're only giving the NHS trusts half of what they want over the next 6 months to tackle waiting lists, which is going to push us into winter crisis. This is absolutely outrageous, and it's a huge opportunity for Labour as well to be talking about how this is affecting people's lives. And also, alongside this, the Conservatives are quietly getting on with the Health and Care Bill, otherwise known as the Corporate Takeover Bill, which would allow private companies like Virgin Care, Centene, Serco to sit on NHS boards, making decisions about NHS spending and about the kind of care that people receive. And we're fighting hard against that bill, along with lots of other campaigning organisations and along with Labour. So if you want to join that fight and you're not in that fight, you can sign up at weownit.org.uk. It's not just about the NHS, though, it's about all public services. As John Trickett said earlier, Corbyn's policies for public ownership, for public services in public hands, were actually incredibly popular. They got more popular over the years from 2017 to 2019. Yes, in many ways, this is a Conservative country, but people believe in public services for people, not profit. They believe in the idea of public services. And that is why Boris Johnson branded the NHS legislation as a kind of take back, as a reinstatement, when it's nothing of the sort. That's why he also branded the new plans for Great British Railways as also taking back our railways, when again, it's nothing of the sort, it's continued privatisation. Labour can win as the party of the NHS, as the party that stands up for our NHS and against the damage that the government is doing. It can win as a party of public services and say that these cuts and this privatisation is unacceptable, whether it's talking about rail or buses or energy or water, our polluted rivers, our high utility bills, whether it's talking about parks or probation or leisure services or bins, all of these vital services that we need. Labour is the party that could naturally be defending them even more and pointing out that we don't have the quality of life we should have right now because of Tory choices. And Labour can also be the party of patriotism even, because people don't actually want private shareholders in other countries receiving, huge amounts of money from our public services. And that is a good kind of patriotism that we can embrace. We should own our public services, they should belong to us. Public services are a real weak point for the Tories, and Labour can tell a clear story that the public already believes in, that they should be funded properly, that they should be funded fairly, and that they should work for people, not profit. Thank you.
Kat, thank you. Absolutely brilliant timing and an excellent presentation, as always. Thank you very much for having been with us. We're now very pleased to have our second international speaker. We're going to have sequential translation. Francisco Dominguez is going to translate for us. Our speaker is Hugo Guterres, who's a elected left member of Chile's Constitutional Convention. Hugo, bienvenido. We're very pleased that you're with us, but we understand that if you want to leave at the end of your contribution, please feel free to do so. Okay, the floor is yours, Hugo, and indeed Francisco.
Hugo, bienvenido. Gracias por estar aquí. Por favor, habilita tu micrófono para comenzar tu presentación. Hugo. I think somebody needs to unmute him from wherever. Yeah, he's telling me that he cannot do it. He cannot unmute himself. So can somebody unmute him?
¿Aló? ¿Me escuchan?
Can you hear me? I'm translating over now. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Te podemos escuchar. Adelante, por favor.
Thank you. Hoy se cumple en mi patria Chile 48 años del golpe de Estado.
Today in my land, Chile, there is the anniversary, the 48th anniversary of the coup d'etat that took place there.
Que encabezaran las Fuerzas Armadas con un general de apellido Pinochet.
The coup that was led by the armed forces, led by a general of surname Pinochet.
Que devino en el dictador de turno en mi país.
Who became the dictator at the time in my country.
Se trató de una dictadura cívico-militar a través de la cual la oligarquía chilena recuperaba sus privilegios perdidos.
It was about a military civilian dictatorship through which our local national oligarchy was able to recover some of the privileges that it has lost under Allende.
Por las políticas socialistas implementadas por el gobierno, como bien dices tú, del presidente Salvador Allende.
The oligarchy has lost those privileges thanks to the socialist policies applied by our president Salvador Allende at that time.
A estos casi 50 años del golpe de Estado, encuentra a Chile embuido de un inédito proceso constituyente.
After nearly 50 years of this dictatorship, this coup d'etat, now Chile is in the midst of a constitutional process of transformation.
Decimos inédito, original, porque en sus 200 años de vida independiente de nuestro país, nunca el pueblo de Chile se había reunido en una asamblea constituyente.
We say this is totally unprecedented because never in the 200 years of constitutional history of the country, the people of Chile have met to organize and set up a constituent assembly to change society.
Una asamblea autónoma establecida para redactar una nueva constitución política para Chile.
This is an autonomous constituent assembly whose job is to produce a new constitution for Chile.
Pero también lo inédito está porque esta asamblea constituyente es paritaria, mitad hombre, mitad mujeres.
Also what is present in this constituent assembly is that is equal positions for women and men, 50 and 50%. for the first time in the country.
Va a quedar claro de que todo órgano político que se instituya en la nueva constitución política va a ser paritario, ya nunca más un órgano político que solo esté compuesta por hombres o en su mayoría por hombres.
The Constituent Assembly is going to produce a new constitution in which or through which any organization, any body of the state or any institution of the state that exists, that is set up, will have to have this parity of 50-50%. Never again it will be accepted that there is a male-dominated institution or a male majority. It'll have to be 50-50.
Es un proceso constituyente que además se hace con los pueblos originarios, reconociendo los primeros pueblos que existían antes de la existencia de la República de Chile.
What is also unprecedented is also this new constitution, this constitutional process being conducted together with the original inhabitants of the nation. The first people that were there are also central part of the transformation process.
Además, es un proceso constituyente que no está centrado fundamentalmente en los partidos políticos, sino en los movimientos sociales.
Besides, this is a constitutional process which is not based and does not rest on existing political parties, but rather it rests and is motivated and driven by the social movements of the country.
Una mayoría significativa en la convención constituyente son independientes, son militantes de movimientos sociales y no de partidos políticos.
A huge majority of the members of the Constituent Assembly are actually independent in the sense that they represent social movements and not political parties.
La gran mayoría de los integrantes de la convención constituyente rescatan a los grupos invisibilizados por siglos en nuestro país.
The members of the Constituent Assembly, by a huge majority, recognize and want to visibilize those members of society who have been made invisible for so long in our society.
Es un proceso constituyente que busca hacer recaer las principales decisiones políticas en la soberanía popular.
This is a constituency process or constitutional process that intends to ensure that all decisions that are made from now on will rest on the sovereignty of the people, that is to say, on the people itself.
Junto a este proceso constituyente está el proceso electoral presidencial.
Together with this constitutional process, there is an election for presidency that is also going to take place later.
Este 21 de noviembre vamos a elegir presidente de Chile.
This 21st of November, this coming 21st of November, we're going to elect a new president of Chile.
Hay una real posibilidad que el representante de la izquierda chilena, Gabriel Boric, y su conglomerado político Apruebo Dignidad lleguen al gobierno.
There is a strong possibility that Gabriel Boric, who is representative of the left, actually wins a majority through a coalition politics in this election. So Chile may have a left-wing president very soon.
Y que se pueda tener una mayoría parlamentaria para iniciar la implementación de la nueva constitución política.
And it is also possible that the left will have a parliamentary majority so that it is capable and it has the instruments to implement the new processes, the new principles of the constitution that is being enacted, that is being produced.
Es posible que este parlamento chileno sea el primer parlamento realmente democrático después de iniciada la transición democrática en Chile.
This may be the very first democratic parliament that we have ever since the restoration of democracy in Chile, the restoration of democracy in Chile with inverted commas.
Un parlamento que se aboque a implementar las transformaciones sociales que el país requiere.
A parliament that is committed to implement the social transformations that the country needs.
estamos por empezar en Chile, después de aprobada por el pueblo la nueva constitución política, la verdadera transición democrática.
We are ready in Chile once the new constitution is approved by popular majority to start the new democratic transition to the country.
Digo la verdadera transición democrática, la que nos fue negada por la clase política que negoció con la dictadura de Pinochet.
What I mean by this is that this will be truly democracy, true democracy, the one that was denied to us by the strange agreement that the political class made with the dictatorship when Pinochet was forced to leave the presidency at the time in 1989.
La transición democrática que hemos conocido en Chile surgió de una negociación entre la dictadura de Pinochet y las llamadas fuerzas políticas democráticas que nos dejaron ligados a una constitución de la dictadura y a un modelo económico neoliberal.
The democratic transition that actually we have been enduring was the result of a compromise between the political class of the so-called democratic parties and the dictatorship, and we as a result inherited a neoliberal system and a system that is dominated by them.
Esta transición democrática indigna que hemos tenido en Chile solo fue superada por el estallido social, una rebelión popular que se inició el 18 de octubre del 2019.
These, I would call, bastard democratic transition that we went through was only become to be overcome by the social explosion that began to take place from October 2019.
Este estallido social fue el Big Bang de las transformaciones en Chile.
This social explosion was the Big Bang of the beginning of the transformation, the socio-economic transformation in Chile.
Y espero que de él nazca una sociedad democrática, pacífica y con justicia social.
And we hope that out of this, a democratic, peaceful, and fair society emerges.
Hoy que se cumplen 48 años del golpe de Estado en Chile,
today that we have the anniversary, 40th anniversary of the coup d'etat in Chile,
nuestro homenaje a Salvador Allende,
our homage to Salvador Allende,
a su conglomerado político Unidad Popular,
to his political coalition Popular Unity,
y especialmente al pueblo de Chile,
and especially to the people of Chile,
que supo sumarse a ese proyecto de construcción del socialismo por vía pacífica,
that joined and supported that process of socialist transformation in a peaceful way,
que resistió a la dictadura,
that resisted the dictatorship,
y ahora abre las grandes alamedas por donde va a transitar el hombre y la mujer libre.
And now is going to walk free through the big avenues of Chile of free men and women.
Agradecer la solidaridad internacional.
I want to thank the international solidarity with us.
Y a todos los hombres y mujeres de buen corazón.
And all the women and men of good heart that are supporting us.
Que nos apoyaron en la lucha en contra de la dictadura.
That supported us during the struggle against the dictatorship.
Y que aún tiene en su memoria el recuerdo de Salvador Allende.
And they still keep in their memories the, Salvador Allende in their hearts.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Oh God, thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us. And we were delighted to be able to hear some positive news from Chile, and we send all our solidarity for your ongoing constitutional position and also, of course, for your presidential election. We will be watching with great interest. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you.
Yeah. Muchas gracias, Hugo, por las buenas palabras. Son las primeras buenas noticias de cosas positivas que están ocurriendo. Nuestra solidaridad continúa con ustedes. Estamos encantados de lo que ustedes están haciendo. Muchas gracias por estar con nosotros.
Thank you, gracias.
Thank you.
Gracias a ustedes.
Thank you. And thank you very much to Francisco for translating.
Thank you, Hugo.
Comrades, we've got 3 speakers left, which means that you've got 15 minutes or so in order to donate to the very important cause of Arise to make sure that we can carry on doing these activities. I have to say my chairing's been a bit wobbly because people have gone over a bit, but I think all of our speakers have been brilliant so far. And now we move to Jess Barnard, who of course has had a pretty torrid time recently, but we're delighted that you're with us and you can just tell us anything that's been happening. We're just delighted to hear from you. Jess, over to you.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. And thanks everyone for joining on a Saturday afternoon. It's quite nice in Norwich today. So appreciate anyone who's still hanging on. Look, I think I mostly today want to acknowledge, if you've been keeping up, you've probably seen what's happened, but acknowledge how kind of frustrating and demoralizing a time it is for us as socialists. My cat is now joining us, so lucky you guys. Look, we need to stop underestimating what this is, and it is a hugely concerted effort by the establishment to intimidate and demobilize us, because to be quite frank, we scared the shit out of them in 2017, and they don't want to let that happen again. So, you know, each month we find that another thing happens, whether that's nationally from the government or within our own party. We become more fractured. We are losing nationally, let's be real, while the Tories impose authoritarian regime restricting our rights and the rights of minority groups, importantly. And also, you know, obviously this week, the super rich who so frequently obtain disgusting gross sums of wealth from exploiting us, from our wages, stealing 50% of our wages to pay for their 5th, 6th, 7th mortgage. And that's the situation we're in. And they're being let off the hook while young, working and disabled people are being punished with another national insurance tax hikes and other regressive taxation regimes that just laugh in the face of fairness after the year that we have had. You know, obviously wages continue to stagnate, living costs are rising, things are feeling really bleak, and it's okay to acknowledge that things are pretty bleak. It's also really demoralizing within our own party, obviously. This again is a deliberate tactic by people who are obsessed with socialists and obsessed with taking us down. And the very same people that say focus on fighting the Tories are so focused on taking down socialists. And how dare party officials spend the resources that we working people, ordinary members and trade unions provide them with. We provide them with this to deliver a Labour government. We provide them with this to mobilise people who believe in a socialist government. We do not provide that to have people crawling through our lives, picking out anything that they don't like, any criticism of the leadership, any ask for improvement, any ask for change on policy, to implement unfair and intimidating disciplinary procedures. And obviously, while this practice runs rife and is allowed to continue, that is a stain on the Labour Party. And that is the true thing right now that is bringing the party into disrepute. To the people that are being punished for challenging discrimination, for calling out socialist policies, calling for socialist policies, for daring to stand with trans people, I'm extending my solidarity to you. I know how stressful this can be when you're attacked for doing that. And it's been a really, really difficult few weeks for myself. And I can only imagine how difficult and isolating it can be for other members around the country. For most of us, we don't work in politics. We don't have a team around us. We are workers. We spend our time, trying to get through life. And then our free time is given to trying to improve the lives, trying to build change for the better. To have to spend so much of our time and energy and health battling internal unfairness and attacks is exhausting, and it is deliberate, and it needs to stop. And I want to thank everybody that came to my side yesterday and collectively together overturned a clear injustice. And my message to the leadership remains very much the same. Stop fighting us. Deliver your vision. You have the platform. Deliver it. We want to hear it. We want to be able to support it. Prove you stand by young people by letting us build a socialist youth movement ready to fight and ready to deliver a Labour government. We've heard from loads of people today, like obviously we can't continue to travel down this path And we can't pretend that it feels hopeful right now, because it doesn't. And we are losing. So we need to start thinking about what our strategy is. What are we going to do? Because we can't sit complaining about this forever. We need to take action. So talking about collectivism is good, but it's not enough. The leaders of the left, we need to come together to open dialogue, build a coalition platform for all socialists, and find a way to organise together. While the right are using the weapon of secrecy and bureaucracy and corruption, we need to use the weapon of grassroots energy, collectivism and inspiration, and trust our members. So we need to find a way to open that up and bring people in. And many comrades have been working really hard to bring us together for events like this, and do obviously support our rise by donating. So I'm going to cough in a minute, so just to give you a heads up. But yes, and obviously that's been incredible, and it's been brilliant at a time when we have been really isolated, and you've been able to bring us together to stand in solidarity with each other, and that's been so important. And it's been an incredible job, and I'm so impressed by all the work that's gone into them. But for the rest of us, it's time to start doing our bit and get back out into communities if you aren't already, get back out into workplaces and start organising. If you oppose Kill the Bill, start organising in your community, reach out to fellow left-wingers who agree with you, meet with new people, meet with new organisations who you can build alliances with, host rallies, deliver political education, because we've got to start reaching out to people who might be inclined to lean and support us, but we need to be arguing and talking about these things that are happening that other people might not be aware of. And we need to build enough pressure from the ground that MPs start to be held accountable. What we have is huge majorities across lots of areas. It's obviously really difficult, but there's lots of areas where those majorities aren't that big. Let's focus in our communities, build coalitions that you can push to rally, and hold your MPs accountable. And obviously, if we manage to do that, we can push movement from this government, hold them to account, and stop the awful policy movements that they're moving ahead with.
Just a couple of sentences, please.
Okay, we need to take inspiration from Glasgow, build enough power to stop deportations to our brothers and sisters in our communities. And we can't keep assuming that we're eventually just going to win by talking. We need to act, we need to make ourselves indispensable. And just briefly, in Young Labour, we do not accept that it is our role to be a mouthpiece for older members or for any politician. Young people have our own experiences. We are repeatedly hammered by this government. And of course, we are going to demand radical change. Young people in society need to have a place to organise, speak out, debate, campaign and learn. And Young Labour is fighting to be the home for that to happen. At conference this year, very briefly, we have fought for the right to hear from community organisers, housing activists, Black Lives Matter activists, union organisers, to deliver training for our members to equip them to fight back against bad bosses in their workplaces. But Young Labour is under attack, not just from the press, not just from the Tories, but also within our own party. But if we want to build a socialist movement that's ready to take down barbarism in all its forms, we need to come together, we need to unite, and we need to get out into our communities and crack on.
That is the voice of Young Labour. Thank you very much indeed, Jess. That was a brilliant presentation, and we wish you all huge success at Labour Party conference, and of course in the party generally. We're coming to our last two speakers, and as they always say, this next speaker needs no introduction, and the reason she needs no introduction is because it's Diane Abbott. Diane, the floor is yours. Unmute.
Thank you very much, Christine. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
The title of this event this afternoon is Socialism or Barbarism. And before I get into the body of my brief remarks, I want to make the point, because I've followed Jess Barnard, but I think the way that she's been treated has been quite barbaric. She got an email from party officials at 1 in the morning. Who dishes out disciplinary emails at 1 in the morning? And they were trying to tell her she was under investigation for some old tweets that she had put out where she attempted to stand with trans people. But because the outcry was so great, partly because it was clear that that they were seeking to intimidate her, and partly because of the way they sought to implement that investigation, they have now turned around today and say the email and the threat of investigation was because they made a mistake. Now, what a fatuous excuse for something which was clearly politically ill-judged. So I just want to offer my solidarity to Jess and say how relieved we all are that the party has backed off from trying to investigate her, but it's extraordinary they wanted to go down that path in the first place. So the slogan today is socialism or barbarism. It is a slogan which goes back to the First World War. Many people in the European countries that clashed in that war had been expecting it for years. Many progressive parties in Europe and trade unions passed resolutions and solemnly pledged to oppose the war. But the only left leader who consistently opposed the war until the very end was the economist, anti-war activist and revolutionary socialist Rosa Luxemburg, and it was she who coined the phrase socialism, not barbarism. And sadly, despite what they said in the run-up to the war, most left leaders in Europe were ultimately in support of the First World War, which I suppose tells us that it's not now we're seeing disappointing leadership in the Labour movement. It's a long-standing issue. But not only did the left sort of do a U-turn and support the war, big business, more than anything else, profited massively from the First World War, particularly arms dealers. That's why it's so important, the event which in Liverpool that John McDonnell was at earlier, which was people demonstrating against the arms fair. But big business profiting from the First World War, sadly, is a bit like big business and big pharma profiting from the coronavirus epidemic. Whilst millions of people all over the world get ill and die, Big Pharma and Boris Johnson's mates are making big profits. And the truth is that capitalism and big business are, in my view, essentially barbaric. Because despite the propaganda in the right-wing media, only big business and the arms industry profit from war, whether it was the First World War or whether it's the war in Afghanistan. But because of wars over the past 2 centuries, millions of people have died barbaric deaths. And we know that from at least the time of the Industrial Revolution, that the profit motive can produce barbaric outcomes, whether it's the brutality of the slave trade and imperialism. And it's astonishing how some people on the right are complaining about people trying to raise issues around the slave trade and imperialism and talking about cancel culture, whereas in fact it's very important. It's brought to mind how brutal the slave trade and imperialism were. But there's also the barbaric nature of the brutal way that too many low-paid workers are treated in the here and now. And it's also the barbaric way in which migrants are brutalized. Most of you will have heard Priti Patel threatening to push back desperate migrants in flimsy boats back to French waters. There's no doubt if she gets away with that, people will die. What could be more barbaric than that? So whether it's the history of European imperial powers, whether it's the way the lowest paid workers are treated, whether it's the way migrants are brutalized, we face in this century barbarism. And the answer to these issues is, of course, progressive politics and socialism. So I urge you to donate to Arise. I urge you to give your support to people who are pressured and intimidated as they try to do to Jess Barnard. And above all, I urge you to support progressive politics, the politics that Jeremy Corbyn stood for in the period when he was leader of the Labour Party. And above all, I urge you to support socialism. Thank you very much, Christine.
Thank you very much, Diane. It's a pleasure to hear from you. And now, just before we move to our last speaker, I have a message from Jeremy Corbyn, who says, "My greetings to everyone on the rally and apologise for not being there. I'm taking part in the protest against the arms fair in Liverpool. The weapons sold at fairs such as these are used to target civilian populations around the world. Please join the movement against it. And if you're in London during the week, take part in actions against the arms fair there. I will also," he says, "be visiting the Diggers Festival in Wigan and then a Right to Food initiative in Derby." There's so much for us to do, comrades, and Jeremy seems to be doing quite a lot of it. Anyway, the title of our event today is Fight the Tories for Socialism, Not Barbarism. We just heard from Diane. And Act 1, as we face climate catastrophe, the pandemic still raging across the planet with so many unable to get vaccinated, and Boris Johnson starting a new nuclear arms race. But if we work together, if we stand together internationally, we can win real change and put people and health and planet before private profit. So let's build solidarity and let's build a better world. Solidarity, Jeremy. And now the culmination and the final speaker of our rally. The floor is yours, Richard Burgon.
Thanks very much, Christine, and thanks to everyone for joining us. It's been really wonderful to hear from all the different speakers today, giving different perspectives on the challenges that face us. I realise I'm in an echoey room, but not in an echo chamber, because I know there's people with different perspectives on this call, people brimming with ideas to push forward towards a better society. I want to start off my remarks really by reflecting on what Jess Barnard has been through in the last 24 hours, but also on what Young Labour more widely is going through. Jess was completely correct to say that there's a concerted attempt by right-wing elements in our party, including right-wing elements around the leader of our party, Keir Starmer, to demoralise and demotivate left members, and I think get left members to leave. So we need to defend the left when it's under attack in our party. We need to urge the party to do leadership to do what it's meant to do and take the fight to the Tories, not to the left within our own party. But on the subject of Young Labour, I know that many right-wingers seem to want to relive the worst aspects of the 1980s, and they probably grew up or took part in shutting down the Young Socialists in the 1980s. But we need to be clear. Young Labour has the democratic right to organise and have the funds, resources and staff of the party that they are entitled to placed at the disposal of its elected committee. And it seems to me and many others that the problem some people in the party have with Young Labour stems from the fact that Young Labour members have the temerity to elect a left committee. That's how democracy works. Young Labour has that right to organise, so let's support them and let's support Jess in any way we can. I now claim 2 extra minutes for that rambling start, Christine, if that's okay, because we face crises of historic proportions on so many fronts, in public health, in living standards, of inequality, and most seriously, the climate crisis, which New York floods and Greek fires show is already here, but will get much, much worse without urgent action. All this follows 2 decades of continual crises, including the disastrous wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, following the terrible terrorist attacks on 9/11. the global banking crisis and austerity as well. All of these things have happened in the last 20 years. And if someone had said 20 years ago that all these dreadful things, all these crises would have happened in the 20 years that's just gone, and in such a short period, then people would have dismissed it as being science fiction. Free market capitalism is delivering crisis after crisis after crisis. It's not working for people or planet, and so we do stand at the historical crossroads. The solutions that we offer will shape the world we live in for decades to come. And this era of crises demonstrates the importance of laying out a bold alternative vision to the failed free market model. So the main job of us on the left is to show that a better world is possible, and to lay out the ideas and build the movements to win the policies needed to make that better world that is possible an actual reality. Many of the solutions our communities need were actually in the 2019 General Election Manifesto and remain popular, not only with Labour members, but with the wider electorate too. Our election defeats, and we need to say this, was not a rejection of those policies, but it was a result of an election dominated by Brexit. So now is the time to build on those progressive policies, even to deepen them, as our core values are the only ones which can address these crises. But I'm optimistic, as others are too. I'm optimistic that we can win the progressive change that's needed. Polls show that people want a more inclusive and a more equal society out of this crisis. And I'm optimistic because the Thatcherite idea that the market is the only solution, which has been rammed down people's throats for decades, those ideas are on the ropes. People have seen that throughout this health crisis. So change, I think, is in the air. If left to its own devices, that change will mean Tories using the state, but using the state to bail out the billionaires while letting much of the rest of our society sink. There are relentless attempts from a corrupt Tory government to make working people pay for the COVID crisis, from Tory tax hikes to universal credit cuts, and the attacks are going to keep coming. So we on the left need to be winning the arguments in our party, in our trade unions, in our communities, for a progressive way out of this crisis. Only the left can meet the challenges of our time, but that means urgently organising around a popular programme of practical policies. And I've said it before, and I'll say it again, that means people on the left rolling up their sleeves and getting stuck into the fight, not giving up because things get a bit difficult. It's a class struggle, not a picnic in the park. We shouldn't expect fairness from the establishment wherever it's found. We shouldn't expect fairness, and we shouldn't be disappointed when we don't get it. We need to carry on fighting and carry on struggling so we can win and win again. But a warning to my party: people are crying out for an alternative. And if we don't offer it, then we as a party have no right to expect their support. Just look at the social democratic parties in Europe, for example. France, where the left got just 7%, the Social Democrats at the last election. In the polls, we're still averaging 7 points behind, and the leadership has seemed more interested in fighting its own members than fighting the Tories. It's alienating large parts of its own base: young voters, green inclined voters, public sector workers, Muslim voters, and many more. It can't go on as it has this week, failing to put forward solutions and a real alternative on the big questions the leadership seemingly has nothing to say, and that can't go on. And people shouldn't view the welcome opinion poll from YouGov the other day as meaning that everything is rosy. Everything's not rosy. As I say, we're still averaging 7 points behind in the polls, and we really do need to offer a solution. So when even a centrist US president is announcing the end of trickle-down economics and foreign wars and demanding a massive public investment programme and taxes on the super rich, then that's the very least that the Labour Party should be arguing for. And that means offering a programme of hope. And let me outline, to end my remarks, some of the things that I think should be in that programme of hope. Labour should be offering a Green New Deal that keeps global temperature rises below 1.5 degrees. That's what's needed to prevent catastrophic climate change, through huge green investments, creating millions of green jobs and tackling the huge regional inequalities that we face. Labour should be offering a national care service that treats older and disabled people and its staff with dignity. Labour should be offering an end to NHS privatisation and a 15% rise for nurses. Labour should be offering a social security system that gives people a decent minimum income guarantee. Labour should, of course, be offering an end to fire and rehire and zero-hour contracts and a minimum wage of £15 per hour and full sick pay. Labour should be offering millions of new council homes. Labour should be offering a right to food, to end hunger in our society, one of the richest economies in the world. We should be offering free university education and a proper education recovery fund. We should be offering, for the billions extra that will be wasted on new nuclear weapons and higher military spending, to instead go into building decent public services. And instead of a reactionary Tory tax hike on national insurance, we should be demanding a windfall tax on the companies that have made super profits during this crisis and a wealth tax on the super rich too. This really is the moment for progressives to seize the agenda and fight for a society that serves the many, not the few. So I'm pleased to be with you again. I want to pay tribute to the work that everyone, including Matt and Patrick, have done for Arise. And I know that people feel, in many cases, demoralised and despondent. And I know that people want to give up. But let me tell you this, plenty of people have wanted to give up in the past. And it's because people didn't give up, whether that was Jeremy, John McDonnell, Diane Abbott, or anyone else, or the wider social movements, the wider trade union movements. It's because those people didn't give up. It's because those mass movements didn't give up that we ended doing what many thought was impossible, getting a left leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, and becoming within a hair's breadth of winning the general election in 2017. Those things can happen again if we don't give up. Those things can happen again if we don't give up. But I'll promise you this, it's going to be tough, but let's support each other and fight for that better society. Let's fight for socialism, not barbarism.
Richard, thank you very much indeed. And I just want to say thank you, especially to Richard, for providing a clear critique, but then followed up by obvious solutions and a call to action to make sure that we really do build the resistance and fight for transformative change. And to say thank you to all of our speakers who I think have done a brilliant job. And if some of them went over the time that they'd been allocated, I think that's because there is so much to say. We want Arise to be running far more of these events because there are so many more things that we need to hear from all around the piece, from our politicians and from our social movements. So I close this rally by saying thank you again to all the speakers, but in particular, thank you to those of you who came on the call, who I'm sure have been inspired by what you've heard and will get involved and will not, as Richard said, will not give up, but we'll make sure that we stay on that path to transformative socialist change. We can only do that if we have the money to do it, so make sure that you donate to Arise too. I look forward to seeing you on an Arise rally again soon, and maybe some of you at Labour Party conference. So thank you very much for being here, comrades. Solidarity.